Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. And in this programme today, we'll be discussing the dramatic events that we're witnessing in Syria with the Sunni rebels overthrowing President Assad's regime and conquering Damascus without a shot being fired. We'll also be discussing what does this mean for Iran's ring of fire around Israel that's been decades in the making but has been unravelling since Israel's military offences against Hamas and Hezbollah in the north of Israel up in southern Lebanon. And we'll be asking, are we about to see the fulfilment of biblical prophecy in Isaiah 17 that talks about the total destruction of Damascus? Reagan, it's great to see you on Behind Headlines. Firstly, can I say thank you so much for this sweater as a birthday present for last week. And if you're wondering what the logo is, this is the Arsenal Football Club. There we go. So, and this is a gift from Reagan, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
In commemoration of your 50th.
Thank you.
It's not in commemoration of Syrian rebels.
No, it definitely isn't. No, it isn't. But
yeah,
I'm a true gunner in that sense of the word. So what would you make of the incredibly dramatic events? And I think I've said in these programs that this decade has been extraordinary because we've seen geopolitical earthquakes take place every year since 2020 now. And usually these events only happen in a decade, but now they're happening on a yearly basis. So starting with COVID, the global pandemic in 2020, and then in 2021, we had the disastrous US withdrawal from Afghanistan. In 2022, we had the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. In 2023, we had Hamas's biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's history on October the 7th. And now in 2024, we have the fall of President Assad's regime in Syria. I mean, the speed of events is...
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it, Simon? And those of us who've kept up with Middle Eastern geopolitical struggles over the years will perhaps remember the speech that Muammar Gaddafi gave in the presence of a room full of dictators some years ago from the Arab nations and states, where he said that Saddam Hussein, following his execution, was a warning to all dictators and was a warning to all of these nations. And he said, what keeps you from being next? What keeps me from being next? And he asked this question, and Assad was there in the room. And he laughed. You can see in the video, he laughs. Mubarak, long since removed from Egypt, he laughed. And you could see that they found it amusing. And he was saying, well, what keeps us from being the next Saddam Hussein? If he speaks of the Americans coming for them as well at some point, is how he put it. But of course, in this case, it wasn't America that intervened. In fact, America has been completely, for the most part, on the sidelines of this. They do have troops in Syria that have been combating ISIS or Daesh for some time, keeping them in check. But largely, this has been a fight waged between Assad and his own people, with the support of Russian troops as well, including Wagner forces from that militant mercenary group. We also have the reality of Iran in recent days experiencing catastrophe with its proxy armies in Lebanon through Hezbollah, and Hamas totally collapsing. And so it seems, I believe, that what's happened is, with the crumbling of this powerful facade that Iran has built up, it's empowered the rebels. The population majority being against Assad in Syria has caused them to say, we can probably just tip this facade over and take over. And that's what's happened.
I mean, the speed of it is extraordinary.
Incredible.
I think starting back from November the 28th, we saw attack on major cities in Syria, but the speed in which the Sunni rebel alliance has been able to overthrow President Assad and also conquer Damascus without a shot being fired is extraordinary. And of course, the big losers in this are the Russians and the Iranians, and the Iranian ring of fire that they spent decades building against Israel is collapsing. But also, so is the Iranian Shia crescent as well. The Iranian dominance over the region to convert the region to Shia Islam is also fragmenting now as the Iranian regime is mourning the loss of one of its closest allies as well. So this wouldn't have been possible had Israel not defeated Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which left a power vacuum because the Hezbollah were fighting alongside President Assad and his forces against the Sunni rebels. When there was peace between the two, the Hezbollah then redeployed to southern Lebanon and, of course, building up for a potential invasion of Israel. But also, I think the most important thing to look at this is we can discuss geostrategic politics and what's happening in the region. But more importantly is, could we be on the brink of seeing prophecy being fulfilled in Isaiah 17 that talks about the total destruction of Damascus?
And this is an interesting question to ask. Just read Isaiah 17 from verse 1. It says, "The burden against Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. The cities of Aroer are forsaken. They will be for flocks which lie down, and no one will make them afraid. The fortress also will cease from Ephraim, the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria." And then you have, of course, also in Jeremiah 49, 23 through 27, "Against Damascus, Hamat and Arpad are shamed, for they have heard bad news. They are faint-hearted. There is trouble on the seas. It cannot be quiet. Damascus has grown feeble. She turns to flee, and the fear has seized her. Anguish and sorrows have taken her like a woman in labor. Why is the city of praise not deserted, the city of my joy? Therefore her young men shall fall in her streets, and all the men of war shall be cut off in that day, says the Lord of hosts. I will kindle a fire in the wall of Damascus, and it shall consume the palaces of Ben-Hadad."
And then we also see in Amos chapter 1 verses 3 and 5, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will turn away its punishment. I will also break the gate bar of Damascus and cut off the inhabitants from the valley of Avan." So again, we see 3 very prophetic scriptures, particularly the one I think is the most important one is Isaiah chapter 17, which talks about the total destruction of the city of Damascus. And considering that Damascus is probably the oldest inhabited city in the world, it's a coming judgment on that city. And many have thought this could have been close with the ongoing civil war between Assad and the rebel forces. And now the rebel forces have taken control of Damascus. Could they create an Islamic state that attacks Israel, which then would put the city of Damascus in real danger of total destruction?
Well, at the moment it has 2 million people, and as you rightly said, it is the oldest capital and one of the oldest, longest inhabited continually cities in the world, even with the Syrian civil war that we've been seeing waged since around that time of the Arab Spring in 2011. It's continued to be inhabited. And yet there in Isaiah 17, it's very clear when you read that whole passage that this is talking about complete destruction. It will be totally uninhabited and uninhabitable. And so we've never actually reached that point. We're still not there at that point right now, but this is a stepping stone, it would seem, towards that potentially. It's still a vibrant city. It has markets, it has museums, it's a major cultural center of that region. In fact, going back, you can even probably find, I'm sure still somewhere around, there was an old Top Gear Christmas special. It's around Christmas time, so you'll forgive me the reference, where they journey through a few Middle Eastern cities following, if I recall correctly, the potential journey of the wise men.
So 2009, I think.
2000, I think. And they go through Damascus. Incredible. I have a friend who, Danish guy, has been in Damascus. So it's actually pretty recent history that people were still going to Damascus for different reasons. Not really since 2011.
No, that's very true. But also, it's interesting to know what Mark Twain said, the famous writer who wrote Huckleberry Finn. He says that on his way to Israel in the 18th century, or essentially the 19th century, he contrasted its desolation with the prosperity of Damascus, and this is what he said. So in his book, Innocents Abroad, he wrote that Israel was desolate and unlovely, yet to Damascus years are only moments, decades are only flirting trifles of time. She measures time not by days, months, or years, but by the empires she has seen rise and prosper and crumble to ruin. She's a type of immortality, which I think is a very poignant quote by Mark Twain, knowing how many empires have come and gone and controlled and ruled Damascus is a reflection of kind of human empires, whether that's the Islamic empires of the Crusades and the Crusaders, whether that is from the Byzantines, or whether that is from the Ottoman Turks or the Romans. Damascus has been that cradle of civilization.
And the question that some are asking is that with this recent fall of Bashar al-Assad and with the power vacuum that this creates, because we're just reading in our mainstream media at the moment of rebels, but there are multiple rebel groups, there are multiple factions, each of them are going to be vying for power. Each of them are going to be seeking to gain a foothold. Will that produce stability, or will that produce more instability? Will we even have to see Western troops on the ground in some way? Will Russia somehow inexplicably increase its number of troops that are already present to try to take Syria back? There's a range of options that are out there that can be discussed, but there's this linking that some are making to the Ezekiel chapter 38 war, the Gog and Magog war. Is that relevant to this, or is this a separate prophetic event that could be linked to a dangerous Islamist taking over Damascus and coming against Israel?
No, absolutely. But I think when we look at the prospect of the Gog or Magog war, as it's called, Ezekiel 38 and 39 war, I think now this is probably longer now into the distance than it is in the immediate aftermath of the fall of President Assad. Really depends on what happens to those Russian troops, and I think the Russian troops will be evacuating Syria in a very quick time. The Russians won't have anyone to back like they backed Bashar al-Assad, but they still maintain a presence in the port of Lashish, where I believe there is kind of a Russian naval fleet base there, and how long they'll be able to remain there is still under the control of the Alawites. It's only a question of time. So again, it will be watch and see. But I think it's also important that we look at the kind of timeline of the incredible speed in which the Sunni rebels have actually taken not only Syria, but also conquered Damascus without one shot being fired. So CNN report this under the headline, "The Assad regime ruled Syria for 50 years. Here's how it all fell in less than 2 weeks." After less than 2 weeks of fighting across Syria's northwest, rebel groups swiftly seized control of the capital. Their presence seemed to catch the regime off guard, forcing Assad to flee to Russia with his family. And one observer of all these dramatic events in Syria said, "We are now the happiest country in the world," one man told CBN on the road leading to Damascus on Sunday. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN news report that talks about this groundbreaking historical story when Damascus fell to the rebel forces.
Syria's streets are filled with jubilation as its people celebrate the overthrow of the dictatorial Assad regime.
Assad is gone. Thank God. Thank God.
Assad and his father ruled Syria with an iron fist for more than 5 decades. The notorious prisons where the Assad regime tortured and often murdered hundreds of thousands of dissidents have now been emptied. The deposed leader, Bashar al-Assad, is in Moscow with his family, reportedly receiving asylum from his ally. The nearly 14-year civil war was suddenly capped by a sprawling coalition of Islamic rebels racing across Syria in a 2-week sprint to capture Damascus. The main rebel group is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, known as HTS. Its leader started out with Syria's version of al-Qaeda and still has a $10 million bounty on its head from the U.S.
Some of the rebel groups that took down Assad have their own grim record of terrorism and human rights abuses.
We could have an Islamic State arise there, which will have profound negative implications across the region.
While many of HTS's factions seem to have moderated, and most of the rebel groups are pledging to protect Syria's religious and ethnic minorities, Biden is wary.
They're saying the right things now, but as they take on greater responsibility, we will assess not just their words, but their actions.
Some 900 U.S. troops remain in eastern Syria. Their mission is countering the brutal terrorists of ISIS.
We're clear-eyed about the fact that ISIS will try to take advantage of any vacuum.
It's been a long civil war marked by Assad committing atrocities like using chemical weapons on his own people. Major ally Russia often joined in, its jets bombing Syrian civilians. Iran and its main proxy Hezbollah also took part in slaughtering rebels. In this latest fight, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah didn't come to Assad's rescue as in the past. Russia's attention is mostly on its war with Ukraine. Israel's dismantling of Hezbollah and weakening of Iran played a major role in keeping them from saving Assad. President-elect Trump piled on, writing, "Russia and Iran are in a weakened state right now, one because of Ukraine and a bad economy, the other because of Israel and its fighting success." As for Syrian and Israeli relations, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is offering peace.
We send a hand of peace to all those beyond our border in Syria, to the Jews, to the Kurds, to the Christians, and to the Muslims who want to live in peace with Israel.
Still, the IDF rushed to take over the buffer zone around the much-disputed Golan Heights between Israel and Syria. It also struck chemical weapon sites and long-range rockets to keep them from falling into the wrong hands. Netanyahu says Israel will do whatever is necessary to protect itself.
To ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel.
Paul Strand, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Always grateful for the very efficient reporting of our good friends at CBN. And this is something that we're going to be seeing more of in relation to the coming days. What's going to happen? Will there be escalation? Will we begin to see infighting? We're certainly going to see the ramifications of this takeover with Assad's cronies and others who have been in government there. There are rumors that the Prime Minister of Syria was actively in contact with rebel leaders seeking to negotiate their takeover.
Well, it seems there's some sort of negotiation because, Damascus fell without a shot being fired. They wanted to preserve Damascus, and the Syrian Prime Minister was obviously then negotiating with the rebels, and part of those negotiations would have been the fact that they wanted safe passage for President Assad and his family to flee Syria. There was a fake news story coming out that the plane carrying President Assad had actually crashed and gone off the radar. I think this was to give the Assad family more time to make sure that they landed safely on Russian soil to prevent maybe a surface air missile to actually take out the aircraft as it was leaving Syrian airspace. That's the only conclusion I can come to. But I think the next few weeks and months will be telling in which direction the Syrian new government will take, and the very makeup of this new government as well. Will it be an ally of the West, or will it be a threat to the West? That's the big question.
Let's do a timeline walkthrough, shall we, of what's gone on in the past few weeks in Syria. November 27th, rebel forces launched their first attack. The Syrian rebel forces launched a large-scale attack on Assad's forces in western Aleppo, the first sign of what was to come from their offensive and marking the first flare-up between the two sides in years. This has been dormant for a period of time. We have the groupings that have been formulating and gaining increased capacity in their own weaponry arsenals. At least 37 people were killed, both regime forces and allied militia, with rebels seizing 13 villages, including the strategic towns of al-Sukra and Anjara, as well as Base 46, the latest Syrian regime army base in the largest Syrian regime army base in western Aleppo, according to a statement by opposition factions at the time. Now, it was unclear then if the attacks meant anything more. unclear, yes, to some degree, but also quite clear that they at least have gained a major city. What will this look like for Assad? Rebel groups said that they were in response to recent artillery shelling from Assad's regime, but quickly became clear that this was going to be the beginning of the end for Assad, as 3 days later, the first city would fall, with rebels taking control of Aleppo city on November the 30th. On November 30th, rebel groups conducted a lightning-fast offensive, killing dozens of government soldiers, taking control of Aleppo, Syria's second largest city. It was the first time they had set foot there since government forces regained control in 2016, and by early morning they had seized large parts of the city. Footage geolocated by CNN have revealed, with the Syrian army tacitly acknowledging its forces were in retreat, saying large numbers of terrorists had forced it to implement a redeployment operation. It said reinforcements were on their way and government forces were preparing for a counter-offensive.
And then we saw on the 5th of December, the rebel alliance actually take Hama. So Hama is strategically located at the crossroads in western central Syria, providing a direct supply lines between Damascus and Aleppo, and the Assad regime had held Hama for more than a decade. But by Thursday, the Syrian military said it had withdrawn after the rebels penetrated several parts of the city. Videos geolocated by CNN shows rebel fighters celebrating almost in disbelief at their progress as they entered Hama. Says, "Guys, my country is being liberated. I swear to God, we are inside Hama city. We are inside Aleppo." A fighter cheered as he filmed himself to a local landmark in Hama. From there, the rebels had their eyes set on Homs.
And then in December the 6th, rebels took control of Daraa, the birthplace of the 2011 uprising. So this comes full circle almost. The opposition forces continuing their push toward Damascus, seizing the city with the assistance of rebel factions who represented the Druze sect in the neighboring city of As-Suwadai. The army said it was redeploying after the attack, with rebels attacking the forces from both the north and the south. In the southern city of Homs, hundreds of people appeared to flee on Friday night as rebel forces said that they had reached the city wall. And then on December the 7th, Homs has fallen. After moving south for 10 days, the HTS quickly took control of Homs, with Saturday evening the HTS saying it fully liberated the major city. The Syrians tore down posters of Assad and set fire to them. "We were able to liberate 4 Syrian cities within 24 hours. Daraa, Kanitra, Suwadai, and Homs," said Lieutenant Colonel Hassan Abdul Ghani, a spokesperson for the main rebel group, ahead of their entry into Damascus. After the regime forces left, residents flooded the street in celebration.
Okay, and then moving on to Sunday, the 8th of December, Damascus, Assad's rule is over, and the rebels conquer Damascus. Says in the early hours on Sunday morning, Syrian rebels declared the capital of Damascus liberated after entering the city with very little resistance from the regime's forces. Celebratory gunfire could be heard as word spread of Assad's fleeing the capital. Footage shared on social media and also then verified by CNN showed similar scenes in Aleppo, which to the rebels fell just a week earlier. Then they say the Russian state media soon confirmed that Assad had fled Moscow as Jalani addressed Syrians from the main mosque in Damascus, where he said, "This victory, my brothers, is a victory for the entire Islamic nation. This new triumph, my brothers, marks a new chapter in the history of the region," and it certainly does, as we see old alliance really fall apart. But it's also, I suppose one thing it's surprised US intelligence, I think it surprised Assad's regime, was the speed in which the Sunni rebel alliance was able to form a coalition and start fighting and literally take Syria in the matter of a couple of weeks. Was absolutely extraordinary lightning speed. All these events took place. And of course, this wouldn't have happened without the fact that the Iranians weren't there or capable of propping up Assad's regime with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah at one point during only a few years ago. Was 90,000 Iranian Revolutionary Guards and militias under Iran's control, only 50 miles from Israel's Golan Heights. What's going to happen to them now? Who knows? But also the fact that it was also supported and propped up by Russia. And of course, Russia's involvement in the Ukraine as well meant that Russia's whole attention has been focused on the war in Ukraine. So they couldn't come to Assad's rescue. And with no one to essentially come to Assad's rescue, it was only a question of time before this regime came crashing down.
Yeah, this is the issue. We've seen just tectonic shifts in geopolitical structures this past year. We've seen Russia severely weakened. We've seen it weakened more and more, not just in relation to its conflict with Ukraine and some of the fallout after that kind of mini uprising among its troops last year. We've seen it hurt because its big ally Iran has been hurt. Remember, they all walk together. Our viewers need to remember, Russia walks hand in hand with Iran in these issues, and Iran has had massive egg on its face as a result of the total collapse of its proxy armies. This certainly would have emboldened the rebels who for a few years have been laying low. And there's some interesting commentary that is out there at the moment, analyzing a lot of analytics on how HTS was able to accrue significantly better weaponry in the past few years. It also, as a Sunni group, would be well funded, also from other nations, other big supporters out there would be able to supply weaponry.
And who would those countries be? There's only two that come to mind, really. Yeah. That's the Turks.
Yes.
With President Erdogan in Turkey being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and also the Qataris as well. Right. Wanting to see a kind of Sunni dominance and to create Syria as a Shia Islamist state, and that's the goal.
And what we're seeing as well through all of this has been with the increase of technology, and they've organized themselves. The rebel groups previously were not organized. They didn't have officer classes. It was just a ragtag group of individuals. They introduced an officer class to the HTS rebel group and began to facilitate increased training, logistics, strategy. So they've been biding their time. And with the essential downfall of Iran's proxy groups, and with Iran being exposed as not as strong as it's made itself out to be, its bark significantly worse than its bite. With Russia otherwise occupied, Assad and his family were ripe for the taking. Damascus was ripe for the taking, and take it they did, with force and with speed, lightning fast, taking off guard. And what we'll see in the coming days is going to be the impact of this now allied group of rebels. How are they going to select leadership? Which factions are going to rise to the forefront? Some are more pro-Western, most are radically Islamist. So what's going to happen?
Well, that's the big question. No one knows. Even we've recorded this program, don't know what direction this new Syrian government will take. But also we have to spare thought, don't we, for Christians living in Syria. Many have fled, obviously, the civil war. But the vast majority of Christians found safe haven under President Assad's regime. After the downfall of Saddam Hussein and the Second Gulf War in 2003, which the Iranians instigated an uprising against the American and coalition forces based there, turned it into a full-scale insurgency. And many Christians then were targeted because they were then associated with the West, and particularly the United States, and many of them found safety and safe haven in Damascus, which they were protected under the regime, and now it seems like they are coming under fire from the Islamists. So let's have a look at this CBN News report warning of the dangers that Christians face in Syria now, with the insurgent Sunni rebels now taking complete control of the country of Syria and overthrowing President Assad in Damascus.
Islamist rebel forces launched a major offensive against the Syrian regime and now control the second largest city, Aleppo.
This is unprecedented for the rebellion. The rebellion never held all of Aleppo, and it was expelled from all of Aleppo because it held the eastern part of the city for a while in 2016.
The rebel forces continued their advance further south. Jonathan Spire is a Syrian expert with the Middle East Forum.
This must surely be a very major blow both to the Assad regime and indeed, I would say, to the larger regional alliance of which the Assad regime forms a part, namely that regional alliance headed by Islamic Republic of Iran.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the Syrian situation.
We are constantly following what is happening in Syria. We are determined to defend the interests of the State of Israel and to protect the achievements of the war.
As of now, I would say there are not major implications for Israel because all of this, of course, is taking place in northwest Syria, which is an appreciable amount of distance away from the Golan Heights and Syria's border with Israel.
Meanwhile, the Syrian Christians in Aleppo worry they're in grave danger because of the Islamist rebels now in control.
When we've seen them take over areas in the past where Christians live, Christians have been treated badly, up to and including forced conversions to Islam and other acts of that nature.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And this week's special guest joining us on Behind the Headlines all the way from Israel is Stefan Silva. Not only is he a Messianic leader in the Carmel region, but he's also an IDF officer and reservist. Stefan, always a pleasure to see you on Behind the Headlines, and so pleased that you could join us today.
Likewise, Simon and Reagan, and it's great to be with you.
And Stefan, just share with us your thoughts on what I can only describe as some of the most dramatic events of this year, and that is the speed in which the Sunni rebels have been able to overthrow President Assad's regime in Syria and also take Damascus without one single shot being fired.
Yeah, definitely unprecedented events that we're seeing here continue to be unpacked and occur almost on a daily basis. And it's been like that for almost 14 months now. So we're seeing this again and again and again. And definitely the overthrow of Assad's regime in Syria was another huge move like that. I think overall the speed that the rebels were able to conquer Damascus and all the four major cities and the majority of Syria really just goes to speak to Assad's ongoing weakness, to his unpreparedness, and to the fact that basically without Russia, without Iran, without Hezbollah's aid, which he received significant amounts of when the Arab Spring began, just over a decade ago, then what we're seeing happening now probably would have actually happened sooner. Assad's military was rotten to the core, the Syrian army pretty rotten to the core, really run down, outdated, had no real power, and really was just like a cobweb waiting to fall apart. And that's what we saw happen. As soon as the rebels started moving on these cities, his military basically dropped their weapons, they took off their uniforms, left them on the ground, and they ran away. And I think his weakness was evident, and has been evident over recent months, especially the past 14 months of war. Israel has been attacking or attacked Syria multiple times, and really Assad didn't make not even one mention of it. There wasn't one attempt to try and come against Israel or speak out against the attacks. Again, just it speaks to his absolute weakness. So really, essentially, Assad was already a failed leader of a failed country, and he really only actually held on for as long as he did because of the external help that he was receiving from these nations and organizations that had a vested interest in keeping him in power. And on the flip side, the rebels were obviously well prepared. They had waited for a long time for an opportune time to strike. And I think that, they did it on the attack began on the exact same day as the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah came into effect. And I'm certain that wasn't a coincidence, the timing. So very interesting events.
Stefan, you speak of Assad as a failed leader of a failed country. Is that how you would put Assad's legacy? And if so, what has allowed this failed leader to continue to be propped up for so long?
Yeah, so he's definitely a failed leader of a failed nation. He's been able to remain in power because of the external aid that he's received from terror nations and terror proxies. Assad, like his father Hafez before him, was a brutal dictator. They were both brutal dictators. They took Syria by force. They held on to Syria by force. They are a minority group within Syria that controls by force, or controlled by force, the majority of the rest of the nation that is pretty factioned up anyway. Assad's nickname was the Butcher of Damascus because that is literally what he did. He butchered his own people. He murdered them by the hundreds of thousands. He tortured them. He carpet bombed them when the rebellion began, or the uprising began, just over a decade ago. He even gassed them with chemical weapons. I'm sure we all remember those pictures that were all over Sky News and CNN. And, as the rebels entered Damascus and all the other major cities that they took on along the way, when they entered into the prisons, they found them full of, there were obviously men there as well, but there were also women and even young children, very small children, who were just thrown in prison, having done nothing wrong, because anybody who opposed his regime, anyone who posed any kind of a threat, was thrown into a cell, and the key was tossed away. Even if that meant entire families. I've seen some of this footage myself, and there have been reports, and also seen footage of people who were brutally tortured, murdered without trials, and bodies that were found that had been mutilated, and this was by Assad's own forces and his own military. And basically what he did was he aligned himself with the Islamic Iranian Shiite axis, and he allowed his nation to be ravished and to be used by Iran and by Hezbollah and by the other Iranian proxies and terror armies. And they just left behind them a trail of really human, social, cultural, financial destruction and devastation. That's the legacy that he's left behind. That is the state of Syria right now. And time will tell how the country will move on from this point.
Share with us your thoughts on what the fall of President Assad means for Iran, and particularly the Iranian Ring of Fire that was around Israel prior to October the 7th, and what this also means for the Iranian Shia crescent that now seems to have actually broken into pieces. Share with us now how Iran is essentially the big loser with the fall of Assad.
Yeah, so like we said at the beginning, it's definitely a tectonic change and another massive domino that has fallen. Probably put it right up there along with Hassan Nasrallah and Sinwar being eliminated, and then Hezbollah being significantly weakened. Assad and Syria were essentially the connecting link between Iran in the east and then Lebanon or Hezbollah over in the west in the Mediterranean. And so now with Assad's regime gone, and Syria now being controlled by the rebels who are anti-Iran and anti-Shiite, then the Iranian axis basically has taken another huge blow that almost completely eliminates the Ring of Fire, at least the northern Ring of Fire, that they've been working so hard to form for the past 20 or 30 years. We still have the Houthis that remain in the south. There are the Iranian proxies in Iraq. They're much further away. They're not right on our borders, but actually just in the past few days, we've seen an increase of their firing from Yemen down in the south. Missiles that have been intercepted, and there was even a drone that hit in the south of Israel yesterday, hitting a building. Fortunately, nobody was wounded or hurt, but we're seeing an increase from what is remaining, or what remains of Iran's ring of fire that they've tried to establish over recent years. And basically what the IDF is now doing is eliminating Syria's remaining military bases and assets. That includes all their munitions, missile depots, aircraft, Navy vessels, command centers, research centers for chemical warfare and whatnot, including all of their anti-aircraft systems. Now, Syria had the most dense anti-aircraft weapon systems in the world. And that was always a challenge for Israel's Air Force to operate in that area, although they always did it successfully. But now with that gone as well, it actually leaves the Syrian airspace fully open for Israel's Air Force, which have complete superiority in the area. And that opens another route that can allow Israel direct access to northern Iraq and then over into Iran, should the need arise to strike Iran. So I think that definitely they're seeing the ring of fire completely crumbling, and they are even more exposed and open to Israel attacking them than what they were beforehand.
Stefan, Damascus is the capital of Syria. It's also one of the most longest term inhabited cities in the world. Could it be that the fall of President Assad leads to coming destruction of Damascus in line with Isaiah 17, I'll remind from verse 1 through 3, which speaks of the utter desolation of Damascus, where it will be completely uninhabited. Is this at all relevant?
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting one. It's something that we've all been talking about here in Israel recently. The destruction of Damascus, how it could be connected with the events that we're seeing take place over the past few days. You know, Assad's fall is definitely another significant block in the road that is being paved towards the complete fulfillment of Bible prophecy as it regards to Israel mainly in these end times, but also the surrounding nations where prophecy speaks about Egypt, it speaks about Syria, it speaks about the surrounding nations as well. And obviously that would include Isaiah 17. So I think definitely it's another significant block in the road towards that prophecy being fulfilled. How exactly it's going to come about, when exactly it's going to come about, we don't yet know how that is going to look and how it's going to occur. But definitely I would say it's another block that brings us a lot closer to that specific prophecy being fulfilled as well.
Stefan, thank you so much for joining us from Israel today, and we wish you and your family and Hag Sameach for Hanukkah coming up very shortly. And thank you so much for your contribution on Behind Headlines throughout the year, being absolutely exceptional, and this interview was exceptional as well. So really appreciate you putting the time in to inform and educate our viewers about what's happening in Syria and how it affects Israel and how this is all linked to Bible prophecy.
Thank you, Simon, and just to wish a very blessed holiday season to all the viewers, and a big shalom from us here in Israel.
Well, it's important to recognize that very many of these groups, as Stefan has shared with us already, do not have the interests of Christians at heart. And as the previous report from CBN, we have to be constantly watching and praying for our brothers and sisters there. There are many. I know in an upcoming episode of The Persecuted Church, Alistair and I will be dealing with and discussing that more fully. But the pressure on believers in and across Syria is going to be mounting up. That said, I do think it's important to clarify that there's a problem when a lot of the traditional church units, the Coptic, the Orthodox, the Roman Catholics, have had places of open practice. They have not experienced rampant persecution, and this is quite frankly the same across a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, because they're not evangelical, they're not evangelistic, they're not going out seeing Muslims follow Jesus. That's not their remit. That they keep to their own conclave. Also, they're not generally of the ilk to speak truth to power. And so Assad is pictured routinely, has been pictured routinely with church leaders in Damascus, not because he was particularly friendly or open to the gospel, but simply because they were happy to just be in with the power that was. That's changed now, and that alliance with evil and that refusal to speak truth to power will do them no favor and do them no service with rebels who will look at them and see them as advocates and allies to a demonic regime.
But you could argue it's very, very difficult for a persecuted minority to speak to power, essentially to Assad's regime, knowing the persecution already that exists within the country, the discrimination as well, and of course the mentality of religious Christians in the Middle East is just to keep their heads down. Rather than to kind of rock the boat, as it were, and to incur the wrath of the Assad's regime, knowing what that could entail. But I think it's also important that we also reflect upon the history of Syria as a modern state. So the BBC have done an excellent article saying, which is entitled BBC Reports on the Historic Timeline of the Modern History of Syria. So we see that in 1918, in October, Arab troops led by Emir Faisal and supported by the British forces captured Damascus, ending 400 years of Ottoman rule. Then in June 1920, San Marino Conference put Syria, Lebanon under the French mandate and Palestine under British control. King Faisal flees abroad ahead of the French occupation forces the following month. In 1919, Emir Faisal backs the Arab self-rule at the Versailles Peace Conference following the defeat of Germany in the First World War. In 1920 and 1921, Syria is divided into 3 autonomous regions by the French, separate areas for the Alawis on the coast and the Druze in the south. Lebanon is separated off entirely. Then we see the French mandate of Syria came under the control of the Vichy French, i.e. the Nazis, on the 10th of July 1940. And Henri Duretz was appointed as the Vichy French High Commissioner of Syria on the 6th of December 1940. And we see then that the Free French troops and British troops liberated Syria from the Vichy French, including the famous Israeli defense minister who fought in that war, Moshe Dayan, and it was conquered on the 14th of June 1941. On the 17th of April 1946, Syria gained its independence when the last remaining French troops pulled out of the country. In 1963, the Ba'athist army officers seized power. In 1966, we see that Salah Jadid leads an internal coup against the civilian Ba'athist leadership, and Faisal al-Assad, who's Bashar al-Assad's father, becomes defense minister. And of course we have that incredible story around this time of Ali Cohen, Israel's greatest spy, who spied on behalf of Israel because the Syrian regime was a closed door, and he managed to get into the inner circle of the Syrian regime and is famous for telling and visiting the troops on the Golan Heights, looking down at the Israeli settlements, particularly the kibbutzes there by the Sea of Galilee, by saying, you guys have no shade, it's hot. What I will do is make sure I give you trees for shade. So they planted eucalyptus trees there. And so when the Six-Day War started, the Israelis knew exactly where the deployment of Syrian forces and tanks would be. So the Israeli Air Force targeted all the trees, and that way took out the Syrian Air Force in probably the greatest military victory in Israel's history in the Six-Day War.
Oh, it's incredible. And it was June 1967 that Israel forces seized the Golan Heights from Syria and destroyed much of its air force. And in 1970, in November, Hafez al-Assad overthrew President Nur al-Din al-Attasi and imprisoned Salah Jadid. 1973, October, Syria and Egypt go to war with Israel but failed to retake the Golan Heights seized in 1967. 1976, in June, Syrian army had intervened in the Lebanese civil war to ensure that the status quo was maintained, keeping its Maronite Christian allies in a position of strength. Now, in 1980, after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Muslim groups instigated uprisings and riots in Aleppo, Homs, and Hama, with September seeing the start of the Iran-Iraq war.
Sorry, going back to this one, this is such an important one because what happened in these Syrian cities is very significant in terms of motivation for the Sunnis. If we have a look at Syria and the way that the French mandate set up Syria, it was based on the French mandate of Lebanon and Syria. So what the French did is that they put the minority ethnic groups in positions of power. So in this case, they elevated the Alawites, who are considered a Shia Islamic sect, and for the rest of the Sunni Muslims living in Syria, they would have been heretics, because they knew that ruling over a hostile population, they would need the protection of the French, and then the French could alleviate power over the Alawites. And what happened in these, I think in Homs, was the fact that Faisal al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, in 1980 put down the uprising by literally bulldozing an entire city, killing 20,000 of its residents and burying them alive. And that's how the Assad regime dealt with opposition. And of course, memories are long and deep in the Middle East, particularly with the Syrians. So of course, this would have been motivation for wanting to bring down the house of Assad.
And then it continues, this rivalry manifests also in the Iraq-Iran war, with Syria backing Iran, as there continued this traditional rivalry between Ba'athist leaderships in Iraq and Syria, because you have Saddam Hussein was a Ba'athist, right? 1981 in December, Israel formally annexed the Golan Heights, with February of 1982 seeing the Muslim Brotherhood uprising in the city of Hamas suppressed by army, with tens of thousands of civilians killed. 1982, June, we have Israel invading Lebanon, attacking the Syrian army, forcing it to withdraw from several areas, and Israel then attacked the PLO base that was in Beirut. Well, and fast forward, Simon, we can, there's so much that happened in the 80s and 90s and all of this, but we see President Assad die in 2000, June of 2000. He is succeeded by his son Bashar al-Assad, and the legacy continued. We can fast forward even further with escalation of tensions also between Syria and the U.S. throughout the Nazis, as they're referred to, up to 2010 in May, when the U.S. renewed sanctions against Syria, saying that it supported terrorist groups seeking weapons of mass destruction and has provided Lebanon's Hezbollah with Scud missiles in violation of UN resolutions. In 2011, we have security forces shooting dead protesters in southern city of Daraa, demanding release of political prisoners, triggering violent unrest that steadily has spread nationwide over the following months. At that point, we see Assad announce conciliatory measures, releasing dozens of political prisoners, dismissing the government, and lifting 40-year-old state of emergency. In 2011, though, we have army tanks entering Daraa, Banyas, Homs, and suburbs of Damascus in an effort to crush anti-regime protest, with the U.S. and European Union tightening sanctions, and of course Russia getting involved on side.
And the Iranians as well propping up. And what we've also seen now, and this is the unraveling of Iran's circle of fire. The Sun newspaper reports under this heading: Bashar al-Assad's brutal regime has collapsed like a house of cards as rebels stormed the Syrian capital Damascus, a military expert has said. So it says it not only marks the end of one of the most brutal dictatorships in the modern Middle East, but also signals the unraveling of Iran's circle of fire encircling Israel. This is Lieutenant Colonel retired Jonathan Korakus, a former IDF spokesman, describes the collapse as more than just the fall of regime. And this is what he said. He says it marks the disintegration of a long-standing Iranian and Russian strategy in the region. The Syrian regime simply imploded, he told The Sun, adding that the departure of Assad and the retreat of his international backers, including Russia and Iran left the regime like a house of cards. And of course, this is exactly what happened. So the ring of fire that the Iranian regime has built and created for decades has come crashing down with the defeat of Hamas in Gaza, the destruction of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and now with the collapse of President Assad's regime as well. The Iranians are licking their wounds and are the most affected by this, because it means that they have no territory, and now it would seem that this new regime, or whoever emerges in the political vacuum after the fall of President Assad, will be no friend of the Iranian regime.
And this is what we're going to have to consider in coming days, how this will all continue to play out. We don't know who exactly is going to be in the long term in control of Syria. There's its pro-Iranian Alawite minority having fallen. We now have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which seems to be the leading group, with Abu Muhammad al-Jalani leading that. But there are other entities as well. And of course, there's also the reality of Turkey and its involvement in Syria, with President Erdogan declaring in his November 26th speech in Ankara that the West's progress is built on blood, tears, massacres, genocide, and exploitation. Despite his alliance with NATO, Erdogan's remarks could have been written by Turkey's jihadi proxy in Syria. The West's progress is to the exclusion of the East's civilization of divine and humane love. The day will come when Western civilization collapses with great clamor, and Eastern civilization will flourish and rise up, President Erdogan said. How it's all going to play out, Simon, we just have to pray and wait and see.
No, absolutely, and this is why we have to kind of pray and watch as we see dramatic geostrategic shifts take place in the Middle East. That ring of fire that was around Israel, that was built up until October the 6th, has been dismantled. The Iranian influence and power has been absolutely shattered, and now we have Sunni rebel forces have taken control of Damascus and Syria, and it's a question of time what will emerge. But a big question really is, sooner or later we're going to see the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 17, the total destruction of Damascus. I mean, this is something that we know will be fulfilled in the coming days, months or years. It's in God's time.
It is indeed, and what's interesting is that the rebels were filmed following their takeover of Damascus, saying specifically that next up is Jerusalem. They're going to seek to engage in warfare against Israel. That's the reality of what they're stating. And of course, we know the promises of God that He will curse those who curse His people. So this is highly problematic, and we'll see though how God uses it to work out His ultimate plan and purpose.
Amen. Well, Reagan done a great job on this program today. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching this program at home. The events that we're seeing in Syria and the Middle East are absolutely extraordinary, as we see the Assad regime and the Iranian proxies and state-sponsored terrorist organizations collapse before our eyes. And could we be on the verge of seeing Isaiah 17 fulfilled in biblical prophecy? So thank you for watching Behind the Headlines.